Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be kicking off the summit this morning. I'm looking forward to tuning into all the awesome presentations to follow. This morning I'll be talking about native bee specialists, host plants, threats, and conservation. So first I'm going to start by defining the different categories of bee pollen specializations. Some of the advantages and disadvantages for these single solitary females who are just collecting pollen from a fairly narrow suite of plants. I'll be highlighting a few pollen collection adaptations. So some females have special structures on their body or special movements or mechanisms in which they collect pollen from these host plants. And then I'm going to walk us through the growing season, highlighting some of the native plant host plants. I realize we have audiences from east to west. Most of the plants I'm highlighting are primarily Midwestern and Eastern, but I'll be providing resources at the end for our folks coming and tuning in from the Western part of the continent. So just real quickly to ground us all, I think most of you tuning in know this, but bees are vegetarian. And the female bee is collecting these floral resources, primarily both pollen and nectar. But as you can see, pollen is really the most critical part of a bee larva's diet. So it is the meat equivalent of our human diet. It provides all of the proteins and fats, as well as essential amino acids, minerals, and vitamins. Nectar is primarily made up of various types of sugars, as well as some free amino acids. And in general, female bees are combining these two materials to feed their offspring. I'll be highlighting a third floral resource, floral oils, and a specialist bee that collects those later in the presentation. So here's a picture of a cavity nesting bee. The female solitary bee, the orchard mason bee, has deposited a combination of pollen and nectar in each of these individual brood cells. And in fact, more research that has been conducted recently is demonstrating that the beneficial bacteria and fungi that also get incorporated into these provisions may be critical in the facilitation of the fermentation of the pollen, essentially making it more digestible and for these bee larvae able to consume the resources. So in fact, bees may not be strictly vegetarian because some research implies that the bee larvae are actually consuming more of the bacteria and fungi than they are of the actual provisions. All right, so let's take a look at the spectrum of specialization. And I'm going to be going through this graphic from the bottom upward, starting with the bees that are not specialists, and they are considered polylectic bees. You may have heard also the term generalist has been used to describe bees that are not specialists. So these are bees that are collecting pollen from more than 4 different plant families, obviously containing a number of genera. And so that can include both social and solitary bees. Our native bumblebees here in North America are polylectic. They have a social annual colony. They have multiple castes, the queen workers and males. And so they're overlapping as a whole the colony for the entire growing season. So bumblebees are collecting a wide variety of different pollen sources from many different plants, which makes them polylectic. But for some of these solitary bees that are polylectic, they still have a narrower range of flowering plants that they may visit. And that can be influenced by when the particular plant is blooming and when the bee is active. Similarly, the shape and structure of a flower, whether it's complex or simple in form, may start to limit the type of bee that can visit that flower. So bumblebees are large in size, they're strong, they're able to manipulate complex flower forms, and typically it's easy for them to access the different floral resources. But if you were a smaller bee and you may not have the strength to manipulate more complex forms, then you may pass over that flower to one that you can more easily collect the resources from. And as I mentioned, seasonal activities. So for many of these solitary bees, which makes up close to 90% of all bees, that single female is just active for 3 to 4 weeks at some period of time during the growing season. So that can be perhaps just 3 weeks in May if you're a given species, such as the Dunning's mining bee, or another bee may only be active in the month of July. So again, what plants are blooming or flowering during the activity of the adult will influence the plants that they may visit. And the physical size of the bee, again, whether they have the strength to manipulate flower forms, whether they are short or long-tongued bees, all of these things will influence a polylectic bee and start to narrow down the particular plants that they may visit and are able to access. So let's take a look at some of the specialist bees, starting with the most unusual category, which is the eclectic oligolectic bees. It's a bit of a mouthful, but these bees are pretty unusual and quite rare. Here in Minnesota, we have about 2 to 3 species that are considered eclectic oligolectics. The most common example is the one I have here on the slide, the southern blueberry bee, which occurs in eastern North America. And as you can see, this particular bee is collecting pollen from 2 completely unrelated plant genera from 2 different plant families. So the southern blueberry bee, as the common name suggests, collects vaccinium or blueberry pollen, but the females also collect redbud and lupin pollen, and those 2 plant genera belong to the pea family, Fabaceae. So very, very unusual to have these eclectic oligolectics. The most common category, however, is the oligolectic bees. And these bees can be quite common, and they are females that just collect pollen from a few closely related plant genera. So here's an example on the slide, the spine-shouldered cellophane bee. This female is active in late summer, early autumn, and she is a specialist of our goldenrod and aster genera. So I don't even have all the genera listed there since we've reclassified the goldenrods and asters. But as you can see, given her timing of when she is active, she's easily overlapping with many species within these genera belonging to one plant family. And now we're getting even more narrow. So the narrow oligolectic bees are females that collect pollen from one plant genus. And here's an example on the slide, the short-haired dogwood mining bee. And she is a narrow oligolectic specialist of cornus, or flowering plants, the woody plants in the dogwood genus. And in the central US, we have 4 species. This is one of the 4 that specialize on just collecting cornus pollen. And then the most narrow specialization are monolectic bees. This example applies to Minnesota. This is the geranium mining bee, Andrena distans, and she just collects pollen from one geranium species, Geranium maculatum. If she also occurs further east and further south of Minnesota, and so she may in those regions be a narrow oligolectic because more than one geranium species may be her host plant. But for an example for here where I live in Minnesota, this would be a monolectic species. All right, so that's how we categorize these different specialists. And let's take a quick look at some of the top plant genera that support the most bee specialist species. And this is for the central US, so the Great Lakes area south to Texas. And as you can see, many of the plant genera listed on this slide are plants that belong to the family Asteraceae, or the composites. So they include the sunflowers, the gumweeds, golden aster, goldenrod, et cetera, et cetera. So many of these flowering plants, or the pollen host plants, belong to that primary plant family Asteraceae. I'll be highlighting some of these other plant families and genera throughout the presentation, however. And if we take a look at the Midwest and East, and I apologize to our Canadian friends, I don't have the information to highlight the percentage and number of specialists for your provinces, but as you can see, it's quite variable across the US. So typically way up in the Northeast in Maine down to Texas is sort of a transition from the least number of specialists to the most number of specialists. Here in Minnesota, we just published a state checklist a few years ago. And so our number or percentage is a little bit higher than some of the surrounding states. So these numbers are constantly changing when state checklists are published, and more research looking into different pollen specializations. So as an example, here in Minnesota, we have 164 species, or 32% of all bee species are pollen specialists. If we were to take out cuckoo bees, bees that don't have a nest, that number would increase to close to 42% of all bees specializing on some kind of native plant pollen. So if you need a reason why native plants are important, this would be it for bees specifically. And if we break down these plant genera and families by habitat, as you can see, grassland habitats, and Lori just highlighted that we're losing so many grassland habitats across the continent. And the grassland habitats are hosting, in general, the most pollen host plants for these pollen specialist bees. Forests have very few flowering plants for pollen specialists. Some of those early spring blooming plants such as trout lily, spring beauty, Jacob's ladder have typically one or maybe two pollen specialists. But again, the Aster family is really the heavy hitter on providing many of the host plants for these pollen specialist bees. So how do these female pollen specialists find their host plants? So let's just take a step back and remember the bee life cycle. So for a solitary bee, the bee larva is provided that pollen and nectar provision. The bee larva consumes that, and the mother has long perished after she closes off that brood cell and deposits that food resource inside of the brood cell. So once a bee larva completes consuming those pollen resources, pupates, emerges as an adult, typically the following growing season, that particular bee has never been out in the natural world. So just imagine you're a bee, you just emerged from a cavity or ground nest, you're out in the world for your first time on the wing, and you are a specialist. How do females find their host plants? Well, one commonly held theory is that as the bee larvae are consuming those pollen resources, they are imprinting on the smell of the unique smell of those host plant pollens, as well as any floral odors. And so when the adult emerges for the first time out in the landscape, she's largely using olfactory means to find her host plants in which she collects pollen from. But however, the study in 2008 that I've cited on this slide, researchers tried to feed female offspring non-host pollen, or provide the females with non-host pollen to feed their offspring. And the adult females just refused it and ceased nesting activities. However, they were able to successfully rear males from the non-host pollen. And then they tracked the males after the males emerged as adults. But miraculously, the males still went and patrolled the host plant flowers waiting for the females. So it's a bit of a mystery how they knew where to go in order to hang out, patrolling that specific area where the host plants were blooming, given that they didn't have the opportunity to imprint on the pollen provision, smells, or floral odors. So there are a number of advantages for these pollen specialists as well as the pollen host plants. For the plant, you can imagine if you have a specific pollen specialist pollinating and visiting your plant frequently, it's going to help improve the pollination of that particular plant, because the pollen host plant, the pollen specialist bee is just collecting that particular plant pollen. And so it's successfully moving one particular type of pollen from one flower to the next of the same species. It also is very advantageous for the pollen specialist if their host plant is available in abundance, because the females can easily go into a patch of their host plant flowers. It basically takes out all of the guesswork for them. They can easily collect the resources that they need to rear offspring, and very, very efficient for them if, again, if the host plants are available in abundance near where they're nesting. For the males, it's also pretty advantageous because, as I just mentioned with that study and the males going to patrol the host plant, this is a typical behavior of pollen specialists. Here, these two photos are showing two different males that are pollen specialists, or the females of the species are pollen specialists, but the males go to the host plant and they basically just hang out, either flying around the flowers, or in the case of this cellophane bee on the left images, he's just perching on a leaf and watching the flower and waiting for the female to come to the flower. So it essentially takes out the guesswork for the males as well. They don't have to try and find in this vast landscape the female that they need to mate with. They can just go and hang out by the host plant. But as you can imagine, there are a number of disadvantages to being a pollen specialist bee. And that includes the sometimes very narrow diet that they are feeding their offspring. If they are monolectic specialists and they're just providing pollen from a single plant species, that can be perhaps precarious for the bee larva if it's not nutritionally adequate. And more importantly, as Lori just highlighted in our introduction, these specialists, and many of them, are at risk because of habitat loss, like landscape fragmentation, climate change, and more specifically, whether the pollen host plants may be blooming earlier than historical averages, and that may result in a mismatch of when these pollen specialists emerge from their nest as adults and when their flowering host plants are blooming. So as I walk us through the growing season during the presentation, I want you to keep in mind that, for example, a goldenrod specialist is perhaps collecting pollens from various goldenrod species. So think about the landscape you're stewarding. Do you have just one goldenrod plant blooming? Or do you have several goldenrod plants blooming that are helping to lengthen the period of time in which goldenrods are offering pollen for these pollen specialists? So let's take a look at some kind of cool adaptations that some of these pollen specialists have. James Kane did a study in 2017, and he found some pretty interesting sort of mechanisms in which females were collecting the host plant pollen. He found that some of the mason bees in the genus Osmia used a technique of rapidly patting their abdomen up and down on top of the host plant flower. And coincidentally, these bees are in the Megachilidae family, which collect pollen on the bottom of their abdomen. And he found that they're patting the flower 460 pats per minute. So this real rapid tapping on top of the flower, which then transfers that pollen directly onto the abdominal scopa. Similarly, some of the longhorn bee females in the genus Melissoides and Sphaestra were tapping the underside of their abdomen, a little, not as frequently as the mason bees, but he said he found that the females, because the one pictured here on the slide, as you can see, the longhorn bee females have these very long pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs. And they were able to quickly pat with their abdomen and then transfer that pollen to those dense brushes of hairs on their hind legs. So this is just an adaptation for the females to really effectively and efficiently collect the host plant pollen. Here's another kind of unusual adaptation. This is a fairly tiny mining bee in the genus Calliopsis, and the females specialize on verbena or vervain pollen. And this is a picture of a female visiting hoary vervain. And as you can see, vervain flowers have a fairly long flower corolla. So this tiny female, even though she specializes on this plant's pollen, probably doesn't have a tongue long enough even to feed on the host plant nectar, which is located at the bottom of that flower corolla. But for her pollen collection, she actually has special bristles on her forelegs in which she pushes her forelegs into the flower opening, and she's actually doing that in that picture, and then rakes the pollen out of the flower corolla so that she can collect it and then move it back to her hind leg pollen collecting structures. Okay, so let's take a walk quickly through the growing season, and I'll highlight some of these pollen host plants, many of which you probably are growing in your garden or perhaps in a restoration that you're stewarding. But I want to give you some ideas of perhaps some additional plant genera that you could incorporate into your garden or restoration. So starting off in early spring, our native willows are very, very important for all bees, but also a high number of specialists. We have 19 different species just alone in the central US that specialize on willow or salix pollen. And our willows are separate male and female plants. So the female plants are producing nectar, and the male plants are producing both pollen and nectar. So the willows are relying on insect pollination, the females transferring the pollen from the male plants to the female plants, separate female plants. Two specialists highlighted here on the slide, they both happen to have red abdomens, but they're two different species. They both nest in compacted sand. The females would fly maybe 300 or 400 yards from their nesting site. So you can start to see the complexity of some of the habitat for these specialists. These two species need bare, fairly loose, dry sand to nest in. And then that particular habitat needs to be in close proximity to where willows are blooming for them to collect their host plant pollen. Looking at a few examples of some of the woodland flowering plants that host just a handful or perhaps one specialist. This is the hydrophyllum or waterleaf specialist, a small species of mining bee in the genus Andrena. And if you have to look closely, because bumblebees really love this particular flowering plant in early spring, and I kind of liken them to the 747s flying around the flowers, but you need to look for the little regional jet of the mining bee hanging out onto the end of the stamens collecting the hydrophyllum pollen. Similarly, I mentioned earlier the geranium specialist here in Minnesota. It's considered a monolectic specialist, just collecting pollen from Geranium maculatum. It may be a narrow oligolectic specialist in other areas if there are multiple geranium species that bloom when this particular female is active. Moving into more sunny habitats later in spring, Zizia or the golden Alexander, both the heart-leaved and golden Alexander species here in the Midwest. It's in the carrot family, so it has that typical umbel-shaped flower, very shallow florets clustered together on the flower head. And there is one specialist specifically of Zizia. It's also a mining bee pictured here. She's a fairly tiny mining bee. And you can see her in this picture collecting the white pollen from the golden Alexander. Moving into later spring, so we're getting into early June, feeling almost summer-like. This is a fairly rare specialist of heuchera, and in the Midwestern heuchera species, Heuchera richardsonii, typically grows in dry prairies or savannas. And there are two specialists in the genus Calides, one pictured here and a second that is nearly identical in appearance. that occurs just east of Minnesota, so Wisconsin eastward, and that is the Calides aestivalis. And they both specialize on heuchera pollen. Okay, moving into summer, I wanted to highlight kind of an oddball plant that many of us probably overlook because it's not one that we grow for its beautiful form or flower, and that is the plants in the genus Physalis, and these are called ground cherries. And they belong to the nightshade family, and plants in the nightshade family have nectarless flowers. And those flowers require buzz pollination by some kind of native bee that is able to buzz pollinate the flowers. And Physalis have downward hanging flowers with very prominent nectar guides, as you can see on this particular example. And in the central US, there are 6 different specialists that specialize on Physalis pollen. One, this very uncommon to rare fairy bee pictured on the left. She's extremely tiny bee, and she likes to nest in bare, patchy, sandy habitat in close proximity to where Physalis is blooming. All right, the purple prairie clovers. So these pea family plants typically have fairly rich, high quality pollen resources for both specialists and generalists. And the plants in the genus Dahlia include a number of species, but many of these specialists can be found collecting pollen from the purple prairie clover or the Dahlia purpurea. This is one of the 17 species in the central US. Perdita purpurita, it's a fairy bee as well. And you can see it's a very unusual looking bee, extremely tiny and extremely pale in color. And so if you find a purple prairie clover patch, you really need to stop and look closely for really, really tiny white bees flying around the flowers when it's in bloom. And you'll know that you are looking at the Perdita purpurita. Another very rare prairie clover specialist, and this is a monolectic specialist. It's sort of this bee is in taxonomic purgatory. It has been classified in the Tetralaniella genus and then was moved to Eucera. And then I think less than a month ago, it then got transitioned to the genus Xenoglossa along with some squash bees. But it's called the white-clothed longhorn bee. It looks like a smaller longhorn bee than the other genera that we associate with longhorn bees. And you'll find these females in high-quality sandy prairies where the host plant blooms, the Dahlia purpurea. What's really interesting and unusual for many of these Dahlia specialists is they tend to be silvery or pale colored, and whether that's to camouflage or blend in with the unopened cones of the prairie clover. I don't know, but that's one theory I have. Here is another prairie clover specialist. This is a quite rare one as well, a type of cellophane bee, the aberrant cellophane bee. And pictured here, it is visiting silky prairie clover, which is a fairly rare prairie clover growing typically in prairie remnant habitats. And I have not seen this bee visiting the purple prairie clover, so it may have an affinity to just the silky prairie clover. And lastly, of the prairie clover specialists, oh, I apologize, I've got a morpha on there, but this is also a Dahlia specialist, and it, like the other specialists of Dahlia, nests in the same habitat as the host plant. So it likes to nest in sand. These females are quite rare. And again, easy to confuse some of these specialists because they all have this silvery hairs and they look quite similar. The vervain specialist that I mentioned earlier is a narrow oligolectic specialist of verbena, and it typically is usually only found on the hoary vervain or the verbena stricta. And that is a plant that also grows in dry habitats in compacted soils. So I think historically, it probably would be clustered along bison paths or wildlife paths where the soil was continuously compacted. Fast forward to modern day, and you'll find this plant in similar habitats in parks and prairies and open grasslands next to footpaths, human footpaths, where the soil is somewhat compacted and there's a sort of a mild disturbance to keep this plant flourishing. So while you're walking on the path and you see hoary vervain, take a closer look for this rare specialist. All right, I think of all of the examples here, this is probably the most interesting specialization. And pictured here are some of the plant species in the genus Lizomachia, or some of our native loosestrife flowers. So this is not the same as the non-native invasive purple loosestrife. We do have native loosestrifes, and a lot of the native species in the genus Lizomachia have these yellow flowers. And there are 4 narrow oligolectic specialists in the genus Macropus. And the bees in the genus Macropus are very rare to extremely rare. I've yet to see one myself, and it's still on my top 10 list. But anyway, let's take a look closer at the Lizomachia flowers. And what is really unusual about this specialization is these Macropus bees not only specialize on collecting the Lizomachia plant pollen, but they also specialize on collecting the floral oils. So this is a really close-up look of the flowers' sepals and the stamens, and you can see the flowering plants have these trichomes that serve up beads of oil. And the flowers are actually nectarless. So in lieu of producing nectar, the flowering plants are producing this floral oil. And the Macropus bees are utilizing this oil to both line their nest and mix in with the pollen provisions, the oil with the pollen provisions that they feed their offspring. And here is a picture of a female. They have a number of adaptations. So on their fore and mid legs, they have these really dense, thick hairs that are basically make up a oil brush or comb. And then on their hind leg is where they collect and carry pollen. So this picture is not showing it very well, but this female is multitasking. So she's hanging on the underside of a loosestrife flower. She's combing those floral oils off the flower with her fore and mid leg brushes. And at the same time, she's chewing on the flower's anthers to get the pollen grains to drop onto her abdomen, so that she can transfer that pollen onto her hind leg pollen collecting structures. And this is all happening at once. So if there's no argument that female bees are very, very good multitaskers. All right, Monardas. So we have 4 narrow oligolectic specialists of Monarda. This particular species, the short-faced Monarda mining bee, or excuse me, sweat bee, the Duphoria monardae, pictured here. And she's a fairly tiny bee that typically is visiting the Monarda fistulosa flowers to collect that pollen. So again, disregard the big 747 bumblebees visiting this plant. You need to look very closely for the specialists, because this tiny black bee will be hanging out on the end of those long flower corollas, collecting the flower's pollen. I want to note that the other Monarda specialists do also specialize on the Monarda punctata, or the dotted horsemint or spotted bee balm. And those include one species of fairy bee. Thistles. Okay, so we all have a love-hate relationship with thistles, particularly if you grew up on a farm and associate thistles with invasive species, or you're maybe doing restoration work. But thanks to the Xerxes Society, they've come up with an excellent guide to help us identify and differentiate our native thistles from our invasive thistles. And the native thistles, as you can see, are extremely important for these pollen specialists. Just in the central US alone, supporting 31 different species, including this genus or species of Melissoides, the longhorn bee, which can be quite common. So for example, the thistle I have pictured here on the slide is pasture thistle. I planted that in my home garden it's biennial, so when it bloomed in year 2, the specialist showed up and visited the thistle just by me planting it in my garden. So if you plant it, some of these specialists will come to even uh, not high quality habitat, home gardens, for example. Rudbeckia, a very diverse genus, multiple species. Some are sort of early successional species in our habitat restorations. Others can be quite long-lived perennials. And the Rudbeckias support 33 different specialists just alone in the central US. And again, another plant in the family Asteraceae that has easily accessible floral resources. It's quite easy for the females to circle around the cone of these flowers and collect the host plant pollen. Similarly, Retibita, also in the family Asteraceae, and it supports 15 different specialists, including this one pictured here that specializes on both Retibita as well as Rudbeckia. It's fairly uncommon to rare species. And so the Retibitas are fairly common in Midwestern and Western grasslands. So fairly easy plant and easily available plant to grow in both home gardens and restorations. Ironweed. I think ironweed hands down has the most unique flower color, the plants in the genus Vernonia, that bright royal purple, and they support 12 different specialists in the central US, including this longhorn Melissoides denticulatus. And this is a fairly common specialist, so if you grow ironweed in a home garden, it wouldn't be uncommon to find and attract this particular specialist of ironweed. And if you remember the chart from earlier in the presentation, hands down across the continent, I believe Helianthus is one of the top or the top plant genus to support the most specialists. So central US, 101 different specialists. Again, another Asteraceae plant. Helianthus, or the native sunflowers, you've got to be careful about planting them in a small home garden because many of them are rhizomatous and can spread very quickly. So choose wisely. But if you have a larger property or are doing a stewardship of acres or hectares of land, make sure you have some sunflower species blooming. One of the coolest, I think, specialists of the Helianthus is that giant sweat bee pictured overlaid on the right side, and it's the males and females can rival the size of bumblebees. They're extremely large, and it's quite unusual for a sweat bee to be that big. But you'll find those particular bees in high quality remnant habitats, typically sandy prairies, and the females specialize on Helianthus pollen. Okay, so let's again highlight these rare habitats and why they are so important for some of these rare specialists. So this is a bee that you would not likely attract to a home garden unless you're living next to a high quality remnant habitat. This is the type of resin bee in the genus Dianthidium, and they are in that family of bees that collect pollen on the bottom of their abdomen. The females specialize on a number of plant genera in the aster family, including the Helianthus, the sunflower, goldenrods, and asters. But what's unusual about their habitat needs is they like to nest in pretty sandy habitats, but because they nest in the ground, they preferentially seem to excavate their nests at the base of the native prairie bunch grasses. And the fibrous root systems of the prairie bunch grasses provide that a little bit of that structure to hold their nest together. But in addition to that, these females are seeking out various types of plant resins, which is a sticky resinous or sap, pine sap-like substance. And they use that to also bind together the sand particles to form their individual brood cells. There isn't any research to show which particular plant they're sourcing their resins from. But it is possible that they're sourcing their resins obviously from plants that grow in the same habitat. And pictured on the bees pictured on the right there are visiting Heterotheca, and they are sort of one of the plant genera in addition to Grindelia that are considered gumweed plants, and those flowers produce a sticky resinous substance. So it's possible that that is their resin source that they're using to create and bind the sand particles together to make their brood cells. And here is the picture of the Heterotheca, and it is supporting a number of specialists, including this fairy bee, the Swank's fairy bee, a very tiny bee. So the Perdita are some of the smallest bees that we have in North America. Some are maybe a quarter to half the length of your baby fingernail, for context. And so they are typically looking for easily accessible floral resources, and that's often what they're specializing on. Okay, winding down the growing season, as I mentioned earlier, goldenrods and asters are extremely important. Goldenrods belong to a number of plant genera now, including Solidago, Euthymia, Oligoneuron. So depending on where you are, they could be classified into a number of different genera. But as I mentioned earlier, there really are the shoulder season heavy hitters for pollen specialists. And so if your garden or your habitat that you're stewarding has just one goldenrod species growing in it, then consider adding multiple species, again, to extend that flowering phenology so that you can successfully support as many pollen specialists as possible. And that holds true for the asters as well. So they were also recently reclassified into multiple genera, Symphyiotrichum, Eurybia, and the asters support over 50 pollen specialists alone in the central US. So very, very important for the end of the growing season. All right, I'm going to finish off by highlighting some cuckoo bees, because some cuckoo bees specialize on parasitizing specialists. So that makes them, their larvae, pollen specialists as well. And so if you're not familiar what cuckoo bees are, they are bees that don't build their own nest, but they lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. Some are generalists, so will lay their eggs in the nests of multiple bee species. But some that I'm highlighting here are specialists. And cuckoo bees, once you learn how to identify them by observation to genus, can help lead you to and provide you with information about which hosts may be present and nesting within that same area. So this is the two-banded cuckoo bee, Epiolus bifasciatus. It's fairly uncommon to common. So for example, I restored a half-acre corner lot in my neighborhood that was chock full of invasive plants. And within 3 years, ground cherry started to just show up on its own. And that same season, I photographed the cuckoo bee within that site, which told me that it was probably likely, given I had the host plant and the cuckoo bee, that the Calides pictured here would be nesting close by or within the little restoration in my neighborhood. So this is a fairly common, both are fairly common, but we have bees that are fairly uncommon that specialize on specialists. So this is another Epiolus species. And the females lay their eggs in the nest of this Dahlia specialist, the Calides susanae. And so you're only going to find this rare cuckoo bee in the rare habitat where the rare specialist specializes on prairie clover. And even more rare is this particular cuckoo bee. This is Neolara vigilans, and it's only been found at one site in Minnesota, just for context, how rare it is. And it is believed to be a likely kleptoparasite of the pale purple prairie clover specialist fairy bee, Perdita purpurita. And it's pictured there visiting silky prairie clover, and the Perdita is visiting purple prairie clover. So it's going to be present in very rare, high quality habitats where the specialist occurs and the host plant occurs. So layers and layers of specialization. So what can you do for specialists? Start by planting specialist plants in your garden or in your restorations that are regionally appropriate. You can start asking your local growers to begin growing plants that you can't find available for sale. And I think we're all doing this, but advocating for the protection of habitat, both medium and high quality and extremely rare habitat that is providing uh, critical host plants and habitat for these specialist bees. And you can also become a citizen scientist by documenting and helping to track the ranges of some of these rare bees by joining iNaturalist, by taking photos of bees that you see on your walk or in your garden. That is a really valuable tool for researchers to understand the ranges and the range expansions of species. And then you can also check out Jared Fowler's website, as I mentioned earlier, for the folks tuning in from the West Coast. Jared's website is quite comprehensive. He has a Western, Central, and Eastern resource listing all of the specialist bees and all of their host plants. So that's a great place to start if you want to do more of a deep dive and learn about pollen specialists. And you can also check out the National Wildlife Federation ecoregion keystone host plant lists. I'm just going to briefly mention a new project I'm working on is a nonprofit endeavor, and it will be a Bees of Minnesota website that will be launching sometime this spring. And so it's going to be a digital field guide illustrating the bees of Minnesota, but it will be a guide that will be, I think, very useful for the surrounding states and provinces. And it will include family, genus, and species profiles, the natural history of specific species, their plant associations, lots of other information, including pages on pollen specialists. So stay tuned for that new project to launch, and it'll be a free public resource for anyone who's interested in learning more about bees. Thanks.